The search is called off for the night for a youth football team trapped in a Thai cave. 13 boys and their coach have been missing since Saturday, with water levels rising. Navy divers have reached the main chamber. Sandals and backpacks have been found, but no people. An agonizing wait for the families as Thailand's special forces help with the rescue operation. Also on Global, Turkey re-elects President Erdogan. Elections polarize the country. The president gets new powers. The opposition warn of one-man rule.
And I'm Ollie Foster, live in Moscow at the World Cup. The hosts might already be into the last 16, but they're currently having something of a reality check. They're down to 10 men and losing their final group match.
Hello and welcome to the programme. In Thailand, the search has been called off for the night for an under-16 football team and their coach trapped inside a flooded cave. They've been missing since Saturday. A massive rescue effort has been launched involving Thai special forces. Flash flooding cut off the entrance to the cave complex, but Navy divers have been inside, finding sandals and backpacks, but no people. It's hoped the youngsters have found an air pocket underground.
This photograph of the boys, aged between 11 and 16, was taken by the coach shortly before they went into the cave on Saturday afternoon. Since then, nothing has been heard from them. But outside the entrance to the cave complex, their bikes and other belongings left as they set out for what should have been a fun adventure. Instead, a major rescue operation is underway, with the teams reported to have found sandals and backpacks at one spot inside. The Tam Luang cave complex is in the far northern region of Chiang Rai. At this time of year, access to the cave is normally blocked because of the dangers caused by monsoon rains. For the relatives, this is now day 3 of a harrowing wait for news from inside the cave. It is thought likely their children and the coach have been trapped by flooding. Rising water levels in the cave are also making it difficult for the rescue teams to search the area. So elite Navy divers have been brought in to help, having to dive 5 meters underwater to reach the main chamber in the complex, where they've discovered hand and footprints, but nothing else. But there is still hope the teams will eventually be able to find the missing children and their coach, on the assumption that they've moved further into the cave to escape the water. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Well, let's speak now to Chairat Tomya. He's a news anchor with Spring News based in Bangkok. Welcome here to the programme. These children are going into their 3rd night. What is the latest that you are hearing?
Right, Matthew. The rescue operation has suspended just before 6 p.m. local time, or 4 hours already. We know that the rescue team managed to dive past the 5-meter deep flooded area to reach one of the chamber, and then they found their the hand and footprints there that show the evidence that 13 persons that trapped in the cave still may be alive. And they decide to suspend it because it's just too dark the time that they reach that chamber. And the flooded area further down into the tunnel is quite long, and it's quite difficult and dangerous because the water there is quite muddy. So they decide to suspend and then come out of the cave. And now they have the meeting, and they're going to come out with a better plan for tomorrow. But they don't stop right there. Now they are trying to pumping out the water out of the cave, because the main challenge, because of the water level is keeping rising in the cave, and the rain is still pouring down in the area. So I think that the main challenge tonight, I think they're going to try to pumping out the water out of the cave to make sure that the level inside the cave is low low enough for the rescue team to operate again early in the morning tomorrow.
And what do you know about, I mean, how deep are these caves, these tunnels, this complex? How far do they think these children may have actually got deep inside?
From the point that the rescue team reached today, one of the chamber, further down there, it still have around 7 kilometers of the cave. It's still quite a long way to go. It's really long cave indeed, because this is the longest, the fourth longest cave in Thailand. So from the point that they reached today, that they found the evidence that they may be alive, further down there, there's still further 7 kilometers down there that they think that is more than 7 kilometers that the children and the coach may be now waiting right now inside the cave.
That is a huge potential area to actually have to search. Just tell me finally, I mean, the families clearly are distraught. Did they know in advance that their youngsters, their children, were going to be taken into this cave complex?
I think that from now on, I think that the parents of the children are still waiting in front of the entrance. They cannot go back home. They cannot sleep tonight. They're still waiting, and then they try to get the information from the authority for a better plan tomorrow. I think that right now they're still camping in front of the entrance of the cave, and they just have the hope that tomorrow their children will come out safely. But it's still the main challenge that how to bring out all the 13 persons that trapped in the cave, if they found them, to bring out of the cave, because the water is still quite high. They may be very exhausted because they're trapped inside more than 50 hours already. It's going to be a very main challenge from the rescue operation there.
Well, Chairat Tomya, thanks so much for updating us on that story. Thanks very much for your time. Now, Italy's far-right Interior Minister Matteo Salvini has suggested that centres to process migrants should be set up to the south of Libya. He's been visiting that country, and its Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Salvini, said the centres would prevent Libya becoming a funnel for migrants. Well, these are the first talks since Italy began turning away boats full of migrants rescued at sea. Well, let's speak to our correspondent, James Reynolds. He's in Rome for us. And James, for Matteo Salvini, the priority for him is to stop migrants from coming to Italy itself, and so he has gone, in a sense, to the source of this.
Yes, he's made it clear that shuffling migrants around Europe is not really his priority. His priority is to prevent those migrants from leaving North Africa in the first place. It's worth saying this: the previous Italian government, which was a centre-left government, already did a deal with the Libyan Coast Guard to restrict migration, to pick up migrants before they'd reached Europe and send them back to North Africa. That had succeeded in cutting migration by about 70 or 80%. Mr Salvini wants to go the final way. He wants to set up holding centres on Libya's external southern borders. That would be in Niger, Chad or Sudan. He hasn't said which. Very clearly, if those centres were to be on the territory of those countries, it would need the consent of those countries, which to our knowledge at the moment has not yet been sought.
The obvious starting point also in any negotiations like this would be through the European Union. The difficulty, though, for the Interior Minister is that he clearly has no faith in Brussels, and in terms of how Brussels views him, they've been really concerned by some of the inflammatory language he's been using on this just in the last few days.
Yes, his allies, he may feel, are those populist and right-wing anti-migrant governments that we've seen in parts of Eastern Europe and even in Central Europe, Austria, Poland, Hungary in particular. But the problem is, although they all speak the same populist language to an extent, those countries are not particularly keen on accepting the migrants that Italy doesn't want. Italy says we have to share all these migrants out amongst us in Europe, but those populist allies of Italy might say, we don't want to take any, so expect arguments on that count.
James Reynolds there in Rome, thanks very much for that. Thank you. Now let's take a look at the day's other main global stories. And anti-riot police in central Tehran have used tear gas to try to break up the biggest anti-government demonstrations in the Iranian capital for years. Thousands, many of them shopkeepers, marched in the streets, angry at rising prices and a huge drop in Iran's currency. Some protesters say they've been beaten. We'll have more on that later in the programme. Now, Harley-Davidson will be shifting its production of EU-bound motorcycles away from US factories as a result of retaliatory EU sanctions against Washington's tariffs on imported steel and aluminium. Harley-Davidson has plants in Australia, Brazil, India and Thailand. More on that in 20 minutes' time. The court in India has ruled that the government must temporarily suspend its plans to cut down more than 16,000 trees in the capital, Delhi. Environmental groups and many local people are concerned about the impact on Delhi's already heavily polluted air if the tree felling goes ahead. Now have a look at this. A kangaroo became an unlikely pitch invader when it hopped onto the field during a local football game in Canberra in Australia. But rounding up the kangaroo, of course, proved to be a difficult task. The kangaroo's antics made headlines around the world after this video went viral. Now let's turn to one of our headline stories. Turkey's president has won another term in office after one of the country's most tightly fought campaigns. The opposition leader has warned that the country is now a one-man regime, which he described as a big danger. President Erdogan now has the go-ahead to give himself sweeping new powers. Selim Girit reports now from Istanbul.
Never before in a decade has an election race been so tight in Turkey. But President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's supporters did not disappoint him. This vote-winning machine in Turkey held on to power despite a fierce opposition campaign.
One nation, one flag, one country and one state. For this, we will be one.
But the primary challenge he faces is just that, bringing the nation together. This country feels more polarized than ever. Mr. Erdogan is either despised or adored, and he will now assume sweeping new powers such as appointing his cabinet, his vice presidents and even senior judges. That concerns the opposition. President Erdogan's main rival Muharrem İnce warned today that Turkey was entering a dangerous regime of one-man rule. He called on Mr. Erdogan to embrace the whole nation.
Mr. Erdogan, from now on, please don't act like you're the leader of the AKP. Bring people together and be the president for the 81 million people. I suggest you use my campaign slogan, everyone's president.
President Erdogan's governing AKP lost seats in parliament, but will still be able to secure a majority with the help of the nationalist MHP party, who did much better in the election than expected. Since the failed coup back in 2016, over 100,000 public workers have been dismissed or sacked from their posts, and more than 50,000 were arrested. And 90% of the media here in Turkey is controlled directly or indirectly by the government. But President Erdogan is adamant that Turkish democracy is strong, and the huge turnout yesterday proved it. Selim Girit, BBC News, Istanbul.
Well, let's head to Brussels and speak to Mark Perini, who's former EU ambassador to Turkey. Mark, welcome here to the programme. Erdogan's victory, is it democracy in action or something that we should be concerned about?
I think it's partly democracy in the sense that opponents to Mr. Erdogan were able to express themselves, but as we all know, and as reported by your channel over the days, it has been an extraordinarily unfair campaign. And the vote counting and the handling of the results are less than satisfactory by European standards. But this was a race Mr. Erdogan couldn't afford to lose for a number of reasons, so he won. And now what we have in front of us is an institutionalized autocracy. This is an all-powerful president with no checks and balances.
So the opposition are right when they say it's one-man rule, you know, the accumulation of powers, getting rid of the position of Prime Minister, appointing the cabinet, judges. So they are right, in your view?
Absolutely. We've been studying the new constitution and the way it will work, and it's by self-admission, it is an autocracy. There is no doubt about that, and the president says, I will have the entire range of powers. So that is what he wanted, then this is what he got. Now, what we have to take into account is the situation. The economic situation is pretty bad, very high indebtedness, double-digit inflation, dismal state of the currency, and the president, as he said in his recent visit to London, he has a concept of interest rates and independence of the central bank that are not exactly what markets are expecting. So we can brace for impact there on the economic front. There, of course, you have to add the military ventures in Syria and now in Iraq. So this doesn't make for a simple situation.
And of course, we also anticipate a renewed crackdown on Kurdish militants. Do you think President Erdogan has, in a sense, given up on EU membership? Because in the past, as they have wanted EU membership, in a way it's been a lever for people like yourselves in Brussels to sort of pull him back from the sorts of worries and concerns you were talking about. But he seems to have given up on that.
Yeah. Without going back into political and diplomatic archaeology, I would say that around 2010-11, President Erdogan, back then the Prime Minister, realized that in the accession process to the EU, there were more impediments to his concept of power than advantages. So once he had sent the army back in its barracks, which was around 2007-09, then there was less and less advantages in the accession process. But in any case, by now, with this constitutional setup that we have, Turkey doesn't travel on the same orbit as the EU. And as we know, we have a coalition government in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Germany, and a French president who are against accession. So that process is dead, basically.
Marc Pieroni, thank you very much for that analysis there from Brussels. Thanks so much for your time. Now, let me just take you and show you the live pictures from Tel Aviv, because Prince William just coming down the steps there to start his visit to Israel. He's there touring the Middle East, a 5-day tour. He's been in Jordan the last couple of days, but arriving there in Tel Aviv, and there you see the welcomes, and the Duke of Cambridge will be going to the Holocaust Museum a little later, meeting with Israel's Prime Minister and President, and we'll get the latest from Yolande Knell, our correspondent monitoring that trip a little later here in the programme. Now, still to come on today's Global, it is decision time. After 2 decades of debate, MPs will vote today on whether London's Heathrow Airport will get a major expansion and a 3rd runway. Welcome back to the programme. Time to get the very latest from the World Cup. 6 teams have already secured a place in the final 16. Another 2 places will be confirmed in the matches that kicked off an hour or so ago. So let's head to Moscow and head back to Ollie Foster. And Ollie, well, Russia were already there, but it's not going well in their final group match, is it?
No, it certainly isn't in what is the busiest week of the World Cup. 16 matches across the next 4 days. Group A, Russia sitting very pretty at the top, so yes, sure of that place in the last 16, but it could be very important who finishes first and second. Uruguay were also up there on 6 points. They're playing each other in Samara. They're into the second half, and my word, this is a big reality check, I think, for the Russians after those big wins against Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Luis Suarez scored a very simple free kick round the wall, left Akinfeev completely rooted, 1-0. Then there was a big deflected shot from Lakshalt, might actually go down as a Cheryshev own goal. 2-0 to Uruguay, but by half-time got even worse for Russia because Igor Smolnikov was sent off after his 2nd booking. They're just into the second half. Uruguay leading 2-0. As it stands, they will go through as group winners. Well, let's head to Samara now in the fan park there. Steve Rosenberg, our Moscow correspondent, has travelled down there to see Russia's final group game. Steve, a match day in Russia with the hosts. eerily quiet here in Moscow, very strange, and I presume similar there.
Yeah, it's a little bit subdued, I have to say. I mean, there are thousands of people in this fan park, but, you know, the Russian national team has been brought down to earth with a bit of a bang. They've conceded goals, they've had a man sent off. Having said that, people here know that they have something to celebrate already, no matter how this match ends, because Russia is through to the last 16 in their own World Cup. And that is incredible, really, when you consider that going into this tournament, they were the lowest ranked team of all 32 World Cup teams. So the fans have been celebrating before this match. Not only the fans, but also the Russian authorities too, and not only because the national team has been playing well up to today, but also there is a feeling, certainly in the Russian government, that the World Cup so far has been a public relations success for Moscow, because certainly speaking to a lot of the foreign fans who've come to the tournament over the last sort of 10 days, everyone I've spoken to has said that they've been pleasantly surprised by the welcome they've received in Russia, despite a lot of negative headlines in the media in recent months about alleged hacking, meddling in elections, the Salisbury poisoning. The foreign fans we've spoken to have been very positive, and that means it's been a PR success, really, for the Kremlin.
OK, Steve Rosenberg, our Moscow correspondent down there at the match at Samara. Many thanks indeed. The other Group A game that's taking place in Volgograd. Saudi Arabia are drawing against Egypt at the moment. Both these teams will be going home after that. Mo Salah put Egypt ahead. Egypt's goalkeeper, Essam Al Hadri, the oldest World Cup player, 45 years old and 161 days. He saved a penalty, but then he let one in. So it is 1-1. A little bit later, we look forward to Group B being finalised, and obviously Uruguay and Russia will probably face either Spain or Portugal or possibly Iran. All will be revealed. We are reaching the business end in a very busy week here in Russia.
Ollie, thanks very much. Ollie Foster there for us in Moscow. Now, here in the UK, British MPs will decide whether to build a third runway at Heathrow Airport. It's thought they'll probably approve the expansion plans, but the vote is likely to expose splits both in the Labour and Conservative parties. So let's head to Heathrow and to our transport correspondent Victoria Fritz. And Victoria, for decades you've had controversy around this. You have environmental considerations, you have business considerations, and they have fundamentally been at odds.
That's absolutely right. It's about 50 years that we've been debating this here in Britain, whether or not to build a third runway. I mean, since then, of course, London has grown exponentially as a centre for trade, a centre for commerce, globally, because of its position around the world. But also, it's grown geographically as well. Now, when they were first looking at this area, this land behind me, this used to be where they used to grow vegetables back in 1943. Since then, it's just right on the edge of the largest city, of course, in the UK, and right next to the busiest motorway in Britain as well. So there are big questions, logistical challenges around how you expand this airport, how you deal with the problem of capacity that is very constrained here in the UK, and particularly in the southeast, whilst not being detrimental to the local area, for example, and also to other parts of the UK as well, to make sure that a project of this nature and scale doesn't end up sucking out resources out of the rest of the UK.
And briefly, Victoria, I mean, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, famously said he'd lie down in front of bulldozers to stop expansion of Heathrow. I mean, one Tory colleague has challenged him to put his money where his mouth is, but he is not in the country, is he, today?
No, as you can see, Matthew, the runway is clear. Boris Johnson is not here, nowhere to be seen. In fact, he is in Afghanistan today. But he has said in a comment to the Evening Standard, which is a paper here in the UK, that in fact he doesn't think that it would have made any difference, any point. Quite frankly, he doesn't think that this will happen anyway. Irrespective of whether the vote is passed today, they need to get planning permission. There's also likely to be huge legal battles as well, so the deal is far from being done.
All right, Victoria there at Heathrow, thanks very much. Do stay with us, because in the next few minutes, not the easy ride. Donald Trump would want Harley-Davidson say they'll move some production outside the US to avoid the growing tariff wars. We're live on that in New York in a moment or two. Don't go away.